and a very warm welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma Sahar, and joining me is Professor Pant. This week, we are going to look at the various developments that have taken place around the world, starting from America, where President Trump is refusing to leave the White House without creating much noise. He's actually creating hindrances in a peaceful transition. And there have been bloody clashes in Washington between his supporters and the other group. So this is a first that America is witnessing. This transition is clearly not peaceful, and there is still an if from the Trump side, at least, if Biden will, or if Biden is the winner. He has tweeted, and a couple of tweets actually saying that he's conceding, then he's saying, I'm not conceding. So there has been a lot of confusion. Other than that, there have been many virtual summits that have taken place. Today, as we are talking, the BRICS summit will be taking place. Before that, we've seen the SCO summit that has taken place. The India-ASEAN talks have happened. So we will look at all this along with the resounding victory of Aung San Suu Kyi's party in Myanmar. So Harsh, I would like to start with America. Trump team now has retreated from the Pennsylvania lawsuit, and with that, the hope of overturning the election result has also faded, but there is still a big if, at least from the Trump camp, if Biden has won, because we've seen tweets from President Trump saying, I have not conceded at all. Then he calls it a fake election. His former security advisor, Bolton, along with the former President Obama, they've all said that every day that he's delaying the transition, he's actually harming the country. And it's a great damage to the democracy, and this is happening in America. So it's not any other country or any other small country, and this is unprecedented. And as Obama has said, it's actually very, very damaging to the democracy. And it's a dangerous path. We've seen bloody clashes in Washington between the MAGA supporters, Make America Great Again, and the Antifa activists. So he's leading them on and creating a lot of disruptions. So how do you see this? Is there any hope now legally for him, or now things are settled down and he's just going to create a lot more problem before Biden actually takes over?
Naghma, I think he's trying to be as disruptive while leaving as he can possibly be, and living up to probably his name of his reputation of being the great disruptor. And I think his assessment now seems to be that while the writing is clear on the wall as far as these elections are concerned, but he's looking for for a longer term political future, for his longer term political future, which he might think at this point that 2024 might be again he can make a comeback in 2024, and as various Republicans have suggested that at the moment at least. There is no one to beat Mr. Trump insofar as the Republican Party is concerned. He has given them a better than expected result in the U.S. Congress, and he has also given them a good outreach in terms of the voter base. The country is polarized, highly polarized. The kind of democratic wave that once was talked about has not come to fruition. And Mr. Biden will be, heading a country that remains perhaps more polarized than at any time in American history. So the challenges for Mr. Biden continues to be huge. And for Mr. Trump, the sole aim seems to be at the moment to use whatever space is left for him for his own projection as he demits office, as he moves out of White House, and not without giving a fight till the very end, but also making a case to his supporters that he's there for their cause, he's there to rally them up, and he's there to take a stand, if you will, against the establishment, against the Democrats, against anyone who feels opposes him. So clearly, I think you talked of the violence in Washington. My own sense is that this is going to be the new normal going forward in America. We are going to see more of this as Mr. Biden takes presidency, and under his presidency, because of this polarization, we are going to see more and more of these groups coming out on the streets and fighting it out. And again, this is a terrible time to be presenting American democracy in this light, because clearly there have been questions about the credibility of the American system. Mr. Trump, has made sure that, once the American system, which was seen as this great exemplar of of world's democratic institutions, is looked at suspiciously. No one takes America's claim of being the great democratic exemplar seriously today. Even countries like Russia and China mock American democracy. So this is a hard time for American democracy, and it would be very difficult for Mr. Biden to restore that luster, uh, in any time soon. And given the present state of affairs, given Mr. Trump's looming large, on the political scene, I think we are going to see some difficult times for the American political system. It will be a big test for Mr. Biden how he reconciles this during his presidency over the next 4 years.
All right. So you say that he's just going to make it very difficult, the whole transition process, and it won't be easy for Biden. He will be tied up managing these challenges, as former President Obama has recently said in one of the interviews that he gave. That it's not just the politicians now who are divided, but the people, the voters are very, very divided, and this is really unprecedented. Because we've seen on social media and otherwise how there's a very strong Trump camp that is still there, whether it's laws, there's a lot of resentment, which was visible in the clashes that are taking place. So clearly, the American society, country as a whole, is quite divided and fragmented right now. And and that's a very, very dangerous path. Because he's not just delegitimizing Biden's presidency in all that he's instigating, but at the same time, democracy in general, like you said. So this is going to be a very, very divided country that Biden will have to administer.
Absolutely. See, again, the headline from these elections, if you look around the world, has been that Trump may have lost, but Trumpism did not lose. So Trumpism is alive and well. And if Trumpism is alive and well, that means that for a nation like America to come to consensus on big issues is going to be extremely difficult. And look at the challenges that America faces: health crisis, economic crisis, the world in transition, China looming large, is establishing America's leadership credentials in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, all these challenges become so much more difficult for an administration like Mr. Biden's would be, which would be looking back and trying to reconcile these fundamental fault lines in American domestic politics, American society. And Mr. Biden, and the way Mr. Biden has come to office also, not only has Mr. Trump is trying to delegitimize his victory, but even amongst the Democrats, there is this there's this contestation going on between the so-called progressives and the moderates, and there is a contestation over policies, there is contestation over appointments. So I think the task is very hard for Mr. Biden. How do you reconcile first the Democratic Party's contradictions, then America's contradictions, and then reaching out to a large part of the world that has been searching for American leadership for some time now. So the challenges are huge, and I'm not sure that American political leadership at the moment, is up to the task, given the problems they are facing at home.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, that where does it actually put America in as far as the world leadership is concerned? Because these are very challenging times. Again, very, very different, very difficult time for the world as a whole. We've seen how big organizations have not really lived up to the expectation, and at this time, America has been found wanting. We've also seen a lot of summits have taken place. ASEAN has the summit has just taken place, the 10-nation group, where we've seen that there is a lot of concern about China's aggressive behavior with the Southeast nations, but at the same time, these countries can't really do without China. ASEAN's approach or agenda really matches India. We've seen the Prime Minister has said that there has to be greater cooperation socially, digitally, the connectivity has to increase. But I just wanted to understand what have been the key takeaways. We want to increase our cooperation, but we've also had some setback in terms of not being part of RCEP, that will come to later. but the discussion that took place and how really relevant is ASEAN now?
ASEAN, I think looking at ASEAN through the prism of US-China contestation gives you a sense of how far it has traveled. There was at one point there was this idyllic sense that ASEAN can continue to benefit from Chinese economic largesse while relying on America as a security guarantor. I think those times have come to an end. There is a sense that America perhaps is rethinking its approach to the region. Although under Trump, it must be said that he bolstered American presence in the Indo-Pacific, and ASEAN has been a major beneficiary of that. But clearly, given the uncertainty today and given the unpredictability of Mr. Trump, there have always been questions about the long-term viability of American presence in the region. And as Mr. Biden takes office now, there used to be a time when, and every president has this honeymoon period, which American presidents used to get. The first 6 months, 5 months, where they could chart out a very ambitious agenda. They could quickly do certain things which they had promised. I don't think Mr. Biden is going to get that honeymoon period. And I think Mr. Biden, because Mr. Trump will be, behind him, challenging him on everything that he does. So the moment, Mr. Biden says, I'm going to, go and join Paris Accord, I'm going to join multilateral organizations, I'm going to provide leadership, I think all those questions will be contested vigorously by Mr. Trump and his supporters. And therefore, the space for Mr. Biden is going to get restricted, quite critically. And therefore, the challenge for America's partners like ASEAN is going to be, how do you look at these trends and how do you assess those trends? And it is in this context that India's importance grows, because India is seen as a country that can potentially be a balancer. And there have been, countries like Singapore who have openly said that they want India to do more to balance out China's predominance in the region. So clearly, we know that the ASEAN member states want India to do much more than India is doing at the moment. And there is enough space for India to do more, especially as Prime Minister pointed out on various aspects of digital connectivity, cultural connectivity, economic connectivity, and others. I think, again, the challenge is going to be whether ASEAN can first put its own house in order, whether ASEAN itself can tackle the challenge that China is projecting it, China is relaying it, because India has put ASEAN centrality as one of the key variables in its Indo-Pacific vision. Now, for ASEAN to be central to the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN needs to be a much more cohesive organization than it is today. If ASEAN as a group cannot manage China, then it becomes very difficult to sustain ASEAN centrality. And I think that's the challenge that countries like India and other partners of ASEAN are facing at the moment in the absence of American leadership. And I think that's a problem that we will face as we move forward.
In the absence of American leadership and at the same time a very aggressive China. So how do we see that? Because there has been a setback. China has undermined ASEAN, and a lot of ASEAN countries are actually they have issues with China, and we've seen a very aggressive China in South China Sea, in Eastern Ladakh. So when we look at ASEAN, its relevance and its potential or the possibilities, in the context of this very aggressive China, especially after the pandemic, most of the countries have been very wary of China. And we've seen a more aggressive China, especially in the absence of the American leadership. So when we look at its ASEAN's relevance with a very aggressive China, how do we understand that, and how much is it possible for India to increase the connectivity that the Prime Minister is talking about, whether it's social, digital, or cultural, with a very aggressive China being there, and most of the ASEAN countries have problems, but really cannot do away with China?
China has actually done two things which are quite smart from a strategic point of view. It has been able to divide ASEAN. So you have a clear block of countries within ASEAN that always take a very pro-China stand, and you have certain countries which are very wary of China. So now that divisions within ASEAN have come to the fore, ASEAN has found it very difficult to resolve or to come to a consensus on hard security matters. And for a long time, the assumption was that why should ASEAN bother about hard security? After all, America can take care of it. But Americans are no longer interested, and no longer either interested or willing to do that. So clearly for ASEAN, it's a moment of reckoning. If ASEAN cannot get its act together, either it will find that China has managed to subsume ASEAN within its own to further its own strategic agenda, or they will find that ASEAN largely, by and large, becomes increasingly irrelevant. So when you look at it from the outside, from New Delhi, it is very important for New Delhi to emerge as a reliable guarantor of economic security, even strategic security in the region. And that India can only do and partly do if it has like-minded countries working with India. So you can have America, you can have Japan, you can have Australia, other actors that are equally disturbed about China's ability and willingness to reshape the balance of power in its own image. And I think that's the challenge that India faces. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's very important for India to realize its Act East policy, and by focusing on two countries which are nearest to India, like Thailand and Myanmar, India is making a case about Southeast Asia as a natural gateway to South Asia. That India, the South Asia and Southeast Asia are organically connected with each other, and therefore India has an organic presence in the region rather than a country that is often seen as an outsider that needs to be brought in. And I think that is an important message that needs to be put forth and conveyed, but also operationalized, whether in terms of connectivity, which Prime Minister talked about, or whether it is in terms of how India reaches out to this region in economics and security.
So two very quick comments on whether India should focus on bilateral relations with the ASEAN countries, one-on-one, I mean, the countries in the group, or should it focus more on the group as a whole? And how does the rise of the Quad, or the Quad getting more active here, impact the relevance of ASEAN?
My own sense is that bilateral relations are going to be increasingly important given the divisions within ASEAN. If ASEAN were working as a cohesive unit, then it would have been easier to deal with ASEAN as a whole. But because of internal challenges, because of internal differences that are emerging, I think India will have to do a very substantive bilateral outreach. And I think that outreach India is already doing. We have, as you know, India has close ties with countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and Singapore. So there are these countries with which India shares very, very substantive ties. There are other countries within ASEAN with which India does not really have that close a connection. But because of ASEAN and because of India's Indo-Pacific vision having ASEAN centrality at its core, India has been trying to navigate that with a certain degree of diplomatic finesse. But I think the challenge for India remains that India will have to navigate the bilateral as well as the multilateral together. On the other question of whether, I'm sorry.
The more active Quad, is it going?
Quad.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, on Quad, we are now moving to a position where many other countries are also interested in what Quad is doing. So there have been discussions, what has been termed as Quad Plus, and certain countries in the region, like not necessarily part of ASEAN, but like South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam, which is part of ASEAN, have been, and the Quad countries have been engaged with them. So my sense is that as Quad becomes more operational, a number of countries would find it interesting or important to deal with Quad. I think Indonesia in particular, Vietnam, Singapore, but they will, for ASEAN countries, they will have to balance it out with their own emphasis on ASEAN first and other platforms later. So how they balance out those priorities will also determine how far they want to go with Quad. But there is no question that Quad eventually will have to become Quad Plus if it wants to retain it wants to have the kind of role that many Quad members envision for Quad in the region.
Yes, and there has, 15 countries have signed the regional trade agreement, but India is not part of it. And there is, for good reasons, India has been worried about, the aggression, the Chinese aggression, and India is wanted to ensure the safety of its agricultural sectors, its industries. But there are concerns that this decision will impact bilateral trade ties with the RCEP nations, as they may be more inclined to do trade within the bloc, but other than just the trade and the economic part. the strategic significance of India being out of RCEP. How do you look at this?
Yes, I think India has made a choice that it won't join RCEP. If you may recall, this was made clear last year in November, that India made this declaration that it would not join RCEP. And since then, RCEP had tried to work around, the member states have tried to work around the possibility that India would not join it. And despite that, many member states, like Japan, for example, in
Yes.
particular, have championed India's cause and have been at the forefront of saying that inserting clauses that might allow India to join at a later date. Now, so I think
And there's
certain
still
countries.
scope for that, that India can join at a later day once India is assured that its interests are taken care of.
Yes. So clearly, I mean, there is a sense, even in India, that this is an important platform that India cannot miss, and that there are other countries in RCEP with whom India shares great ties, who would like to see India as part of RCEP, like Japan, like Australia. So I think the larger question whether India should be part of such a bloc, the answer is relatively straightforward, yes. But I think under what conditions? And those conditions are yet, I think India has found that those conditions are not conducive enough at this point, because there are two things happening. One, India's past experience with such agreements, with such FTAs, has not been very. Those experiences have not really been up to the mark. So they have not really benefited India the way India envisioned at one stage. In fact, what has happened is that we have seen Indian markets getting flooded by Chinese goods. So the danger was always there that if India signs up to RCEP, this might give China a backdoor entry into India. Now, certainly, this was decided last year, but now that India is trying to recalibrate its economic ties, it becomes even more difficult for India to accept this kind of a framework. The other question is that India wants to develop its own domestic economic capacity. The whole idea of whether it's Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, the idea is that India needs to build its own economic muscle, its domestic economic muscle, its domestic manufacturing capacity, domestic infrastructure. So unless that happens, India would be entering into a pact like RCEP from a position of weakness. So I think there is a sense that India first needs to get its own house in order, and then perhaps the time might be ripe to join. But you are right that the questions will always be there, that from the point of view of other countries that look at India positively, that want India to be part of such engagements, whether whether India would lose out, whether India would be relegated to the margins, whether China would take over almost the entire economic landscape. And I think we will have to wait and watch and see how that develops. But one, I think, point which perhaps might give India some solace is that we have countries like Australia and Japan, which are also very, very cognizant of the challenges that Chinese economic dominance poses to the region, and perhaps will not allow the kind of regional shift that China may have in mind in economic terms. So we will have to wait and watch and see how what happens to how our RCEP gets operationalized, what kind of challenges other countries face. But India's position at this stage remains that India first wants to develop its own domestic capacities before it can indulge or it can get involved in agreements like RCEP.
And especially after the recent escalation of tension in the eastern Ladakh sector, India has been trying to reduce its exposure to China. And all these summits are taking place in that backdrop. Indian and Chinese soldiers continue to be in a standoff situation, and the border is still tense. We've had the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's meeting, where Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping were face to face, and BRICS, which is taking place, where they will come face to face for the second time. So we shall look at that in the next episode next week of what all happens. We have time for just this much on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Thank you so much.